Hello there, and welcome. I'm so glad you found your way here tonight. Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable, adjust your pillow, let your body settle into whatever position feels right. There's no rush. We have all the time in the world. Tonight we're going to explore one of the most extraordinary stories in American history. A fortune so vast it exceeded the entire United States Treasury, built by one man's ruthless ambition and then somehow, impossibly, gone within 3 generations. $200 billion vanished like morning mist. We'll walk slowly through the rise of the Vanderbilt Empire, through the glittering mansions and the gilded excess, and we'll discover together how even the mightiest fortune can slip away. But don't worry about remembering every detail, this isn't a test. If you drift away during the story, that's exactly what we're here for. Let the words wash over you. Let's begin. Let's start in 1810, on the shores of Staten Island, where the story begins not with wealth but with water. Picture, if you can, New York Harbour in the early 1800s. Not the harbour you might know today with its bridges and tunnels and ferries the size of buildings, but a working harbour where the water was everything. The water was the highway. The water was commerce itself. Manhattan was growing, yes, already bursting with ambition and immigrants and the relentless energy that would define New York. But it was still an island in the most literal sense. If you wanted to reach it from Staten Island or New Jersey or Brooklyn, you crossed the water. And that meant you needed a ferry. The Vanderbilt family ran one of these ferries. Not a grand operation. Nothing fancy or elegant. Just a sturdy boat that carried passengers and cargo back and forth across the harbour, day after day, in all weather. The family wasn't poor exactly, but they worked with their hands. They knew the weight of oars and the smell of salt water and the ache in your shoulders after a long day fighting the current. This was hard, honest work that would never make anyone rich. But it was a living. Cornelius Vanderbilt was born in 1794, the fourth of 9 children, into this world of water and work. His father, also Cornelius, expected the boy to help with the ferry as soon as he was old enough to be useful, and young Cornelius was useful. By the time he was 11 years old, he was working the boat regularly, learning the tides and the winds, learning how to read the water and the weather, learning the geography of the harbour like other boys learned to read books. Let me paint you a picture of what this looked like. New York Harbour is a complex body of water, shaped by the confluence of the Hudson River flowing down from the North and the East River, wrapping around Manhattan's eastern edge, all of it opening into the great Atlantic beyond. The currents are tricky. The weather can turn in moments. The boat traffic even then was dense and dangerous. Working a ferry required skill, strength, and a kind of fearless confidence. You had to know what you were doing, and you had to believe absolutely that you could handle whatever the water threw at you. Young Cornelius had that confidence. He had it in abundance, perhaps too much of it. He was a big kid, strong for his age, and he knew it. He was competitive in a way that went beyond normal boyish rivalry. He needed to win. He needed to be the best. If another ferry was crossing at the same time, he'd race them, pushing himself and his boat harder than was probably safe or necessary. If someone challenged him, he'd accept without hesitation. He was building a reputation, even as a child, for being tough, relentless, impossible to beat. His formal education was minimal. He attended school only briefly and barely learned to write. His spelling remained atrocious his entire life, something his enemies would mock and his business associates would learn to overlook. But his education in commerce, in human nature, in the art of competition, that education was profound and constant. Every day on the water was a lesson. Every transaction was practice. He watched how his father negotiated fares, how other ferry operators competed for business, how the wealthy passengers expected deference, while the working people just wanted reliable service at a fair price. By the time he was 16, in 1810, Cornelius was ready to strike out on his own. This is where the legend really begins, and like many legends, the details have been polished over time until they shine perhaps a bit brighter than the messy truth. But the essential story is this. Cornelius wanted his own boat. He went to his mother, not his father, which tells you something about family dynamics, and made her a proposition. "Lend me $100, he said. "Let me buy my own boat. I'll work the harbour on my own, and I'll pay you back with interest by the end of the summer." $100 in 1810 was real money. Not a fortune, but not trivial either. It was a risk. But something in the boy's absolute confidence must have convinced her, because she agreed. Cornelius bought a small sailing vessel, nothing elaborate, and he went to work. That summer, he worked like a man possessed. He worked longer hours than anyone else, taking passengers before dawn and after dark. He undercut competitors on price, offering cheaper fares to steal their business. He cultivated the reputation of being absolutely reliable. If Cornelius Vanderbilt agreed to transport you, you'd get there, regardless of weather or tide or difficulty. And when he wasn't ferrying passengers, he was hauling cargo, finding any opportunity to earn. By the end of summer, he had paid his mother back the $100, with interest. He had proven something to himself and to everyone watching, and he had the beginnings of his own small business. He was 16 years old, and he was, in his own small way, his own man. Over the next several years, through his late teens and into his 20s, Cornelius expanded his operation. He bought more boats. He hired men to work for him, though he still worked the boats himself most days. He married a local girl, his cousin Sophia Johnson, when he was 19. She was quiet where he was loud, gentle where he was aggressive, content with domestic life while he was consumed by ambition. They would have 13 children together over the years, though Cornelius would never be what you'd call an attentive father. His attention was on the water, on the business, on winning. The competition in New York Harbor was fierce and sometimes violent. This wasn't a gentleman's game with rules and referees. If you wanted a route, you fought for it. You undercut competitors' prices until they couldn't compete. You cultivated relationships with dock workers and merchants who could steer business your way. You built a reputation for being someone you didn't cross, someone who would retaliate if you tried to undermine him. Cornelius excelled at all of this. He was, by all accounts, ruthless. He would do whatever it took to win, and he usually won. The nickname, quote, Zero emerged during these years. It started probably as a joke, this young ferry operator pretending to be a naval commander. But Cornelius liked it. He embraced it. And eventually, as his ferry fleet grew and his reputation spread, people stopped using it ironically. He became the Commodore, and that's how he would be known for the rest of his life. It suited him. There was something military in his approach to business, something commanding and autocratic. He gave orders and expected them to be followed. He tolerated no insubordination, no excuses, no failure. Let's think for a moment about what it meant to accumulate wealth in this era, because it was very different from later times. This was before corporations as we know them, before stock markets were sophisticated or widely accessible, before most of the financial infrastructure that would later make wealth creation easier and faster. If you wanted to build wealth, you did it through direct ownership, an operation of a business. You bought assets, boats. In Cornelius's case, and you worked them hard, you reinvested profits into more assets. You grew slowly, incrementally, through long hours and constant attention. And Cornelius never spent money unnecessarily. This is crucial to understanding him. Even as his ferry business grew, even as he started accumulating real wealth, he lived simply. He wore old clothes until they wore out. He lived in a modest house. He ate simple food. Every dollar that didn't absolutely need to be spent on living expenses went back into the business. This frugality, this almost pathological refusal to enjoy the fruits of his labour, would characterize his entire life. He built wealth not to spend it, but to accumulate it, to see the number grow, to win the game of commerce. By his late 20s and early 30s in the 1820s, Cornelius Vanderbilt had become one of the most successful ferry and coastal shipping operators in New York Harbor. He owned multiple vessels. He employed dozens of men. He was making real money, thousands of dollars a year, which was a substantial income in that era. But he was restless. He could see that the ferry business, while profitable, had limits. There were only so many routes, only so much business, only so much you could charge. If he wanted to build real wealth, the kind of wealth that mattered, he would need to think bigger. The technology that would allow him to think bigger was already emerging, churning up and down the Hudson River with clouds of black smoke and a noise like nothing the world had heard before. Steamships. And Cornelius Vanderbilt, the ferryman's son from Staten Island, was about to recognize the future when he saw it. He was about to make the first of several brilliant pivots that would transform him from a successful local operator into one of the richest men in American history. But we'll come to that. For now, picture that young man on his ferry, strong arms working the oars or adjusting the sail, eyes always scanning the water for opportunity, mind always calculating the next move. He was building something. He didn't know yet how big it would become. He couldn't imagine that his name would one day be synonymous with American wealth, that his descendants would build mansions that would become monuments, that his fortune would grow to a size that would dwarf the entire federal treasury. He just knew he wanted to win, and he knew he would do whatever it took. Let that image settle in your mind. The water, the boats, the young man with absolute confidence in his own ability to conquer whatever he set his mind to. We're just beginning. The fortune hasn't been built yet. The mansions don't exist. The Gilded Age is still decades away. But the seed is planted, the pattern is established, and everything that follows, all the wealth and all its eventual disappearance, starts here, on the water, with a 16-year-old boy and a $100 loan. The future arrived on the Hudson River in the form of smoke and steam and noise that shattered the old quiet of sail. Robert Fulton's steamboat, the Clermont, had made its first successful voyage up the Hudson in 1807, when Cornelius was just 13 years old. At the time, most people thought it was a curiosity, a noisy experiment that would never replace the grace and reliability of sail. But some people, the ones with vision, the ones willing to imagine a different future, saw something else. They saw the end of one era and the beginning of another. They saw opportunity. Cornelius Vanderbilt saw it too, though it took him a while to fully commit. Through the 1820s, he was still primarily in the sailing ferry and coastal shipping business, the world he knew, the world where he'd built his reputation and his initial wealth. But he was watching the steamships multiply on the Hudson, watching them carry passengers and cargo faster than sail ever could, watching the future unfold in clouds of black smoke. Let's think about what steam power meant, because the transformation it brought was profound and not just technological. A sailing vessel was at the mercy of wind and tide. You could be a brilliant sailor, know every trick and technique, but if the wind didn't blow or blew from the wrong direction, you waited. You were subject to nature's schedule, not your own. But a steamship was different. A steamship moved when you wanted it to move, at a speed you could control, on a schedule you could promise. It liberated transportation from nature's whims, and in commerce, reliability and speed translated directly into competitive advantage. By the late 1820s, Cornelius made his decision. He would pivot to steam. This wasn't a tentative experiment or a side venture. When Cornelius committed to something, he committed absolutely. He sold many of his sailing vessels and invested everything in steam. But here's what made him different from many other entrepreneurs of his era. He didn't start by buying or building his own steamships immediately. Instead, he went to work for someone else. Thomas Gibbons was a wealthy steamship operator who needed a captain and manager for his vessels running between New Jersey and New York. Cornelius took the job at a salary of $60 a month plus living quarters. For a man who had been his own boss since he was 16, this might have seemed like a step backward. But Cornelius was learning. He was studying the steamship business from the inside, understanding the mechanics, the economics, the operational challenges. He was being paid to get an education, and he was running Gibbons's business brilliantly. Under Cornelius's management, the routes became more profitable than they had ever been. He cut costs ruthlessly. He improved efficiency. He pushed the crews hard. He undercut competitors on fares and made up the difference in volume. The Gibbons steamship line thrived, and Cornelius learned everything there was to know about running a steamship operation. During this time, something else important happened. Cornelius and Gibbons were operating in defiance of a monopoly that the state of New York had granted to a rival company. The legal battle that ensued went all the way to the Supreme Court, where Chief Justice John Marshall ruled in 1824 that states could not grant monopolies that interfered with interstate commerce. This was a landmark decision, opening up steamship routes to competition, and Cornelius absorbed the lesson. Monopolies were valuable when you held them, but the law was flexible, and aggressive competition could break even legal barriers. He worked for Gibbons for more than a decade, living frugally, saving his salary, studying the business. His wife Sophia managed a tavern and boarding house that Gibbons owned, adding to the family income. The Vanderbilt children, and there were many of them, one after another through these years, grew up in this boarding house, surrounded by travellers and commerce, learning their father's relentless focus on business, even if they saw little of him directly. By 1829, when Cornelius was 35 years old, he had saved enough and learned enough. He left Gibbons and started his own steamship company, and here's where the Commodore's competitive genius truly revealed itself. His strategy was brilliantly simple and brutally effective. He would enter a route, cut prices to a level where he was barely breaking even or even losing money, drive his competitors to financial exhaustion, and then either buy them out cheaply or watch them quit the business. Once he had the route to himself, he'd raise prices to profitable levels. Then he'd move to the next route and do it again. This required deep pockets and iron nerves. You had to be willing to lose money in the short term, confident that you could outlast your competitors. You had to be willing to endure their anger, their accusations of unfair practices, their attempts to fight back, and you had to be willing to be ruthless when they finally gave up and came to negotiate. Cornelius had all of these qualities in abundance. He built a fleet of steamships that ran routes up and down the Hudson River, along the Long Island Sound, down the coast to Philadelphia and beyond. Each route followed the same pattern: enter with dramatically low prices, endure the price war, outlast the competition, consolidate control. Raise prices to monopoly levels. His competitors learned to dread seeing Vanderbilt enter their market. Some tried to pay him to stay away, literally offering him money not to compete. He would take their money, stay away from that particular route, and then enter a different one. The steamships themselves were not luxurious, at least not at first. Cornelius cared about function, not form. His vessels were maintained adequately but not lavishly. They ran on time. They were safe enough. They got you where you were going at a competitive price. That was sufficient. Why spend money on gilt and velvet when passengers were choosing based on price and schedule? Through the 1830s and 1840s, the Vanderbilt steamship empire grew steadily. He was making real money now, tens of thousands of dollars a year, then hundreds of thousands. By the standards of the era, he was becoming wealthy. Not Astor-level wealthy yet. John Jacob Astor's fur and real estate fortune was still the benchmark for American wealth, but wealthy enough to matter, wealthy enough to be noticed. And yet, his personal life remained austere. He lived in a modest house on Staten Island. He wore the same old clothes. He ate simple food. Visitors to his home were often surprised by how ordinary it was, how little it reflected his growing fortune. Sophia managed the household with the same frugality she'd learned in those boarding house years. The children wore hand-me-downs and learned early that their father, while increasingly rich, would not indulge them. Cornelius's relationship with his children was distant and transactional. He expected obedience and deference. He showed little affection and less interest in their individual personalities or aspirations. They were, in his view, part of the household, assets to be managed like any other. Some of them would later say they feared him more than loved him. His wife Sophia suffered quietly through his absences, his infidelities, his domineering nature. But she stayed, raised the children, managed the household, and said little about her own feelings. This was the bargain of their marriage. By the late 1840s, an event occurred that would give Cornelius his greatest opportunity yet, the California Gold Rush. In 1848, gold was discovered at Sutter's Mill, and by 1849 tens of thousands of people were desperate to get to California as quickly as possible. The problem was geography. You could go overland, which was slow, dangerous, and difficult. Or you could go by sea around Cape Horn at the southern tip of South America, which was safer but incredibly slow, a voyage of 6 months or more. Cornelius saw a third option. Look at a map of the Americas and you'll see Central America, that narrow isthmus connecting north and south. In Nicaragua, there was a route using rivers and a lake that cut across most of the country, requiring only a short overland segment. If you could establish a reliable transportation system using this Nicaragua route, you could get passengers from New York to California in a month instead of 6. You could charge premium prices. You could make a fortune. The Nicaragua route wasn't new or secret. Others had tried to exploit it. But Cornelius approached it with his characteristic combination of ambition and ruthlessness. He formed the Accessory Transit Company in 1850 and began running steamships from New York to the eastern coast of Nicaragua, where passengers would transfer to riverboats and carriages for the crossing. Then bought another steamship on the Pacific side for the final leg to San Francisco. It was a complex operation requiring coordination across multiple modes of transportation, managing employees in foreign countries, dealing with the Nicaraguan government, competing with rival routes through Panama. But Cornelius made it work. At its peak, his Nicaragua route was transporting thousands of passengers per month, each paying hundreds of dollars for the journey. The profits were enormous. The company was paying dividends of 40% annually to shareholders. Cornelius himself, who controlled the company through various financial maneuvers, was extracting wealth from it through multiple channels. This period, the early 1850s, marked Cornelius's arrival as one of America's wealthiest men. He was now competing with the Astors and the old merchant princes, with the new railroad magnates and industrial capitalists. His fortune was estimated at several $1 million, which in the 1850s represented truly staggering wealth. To put it in perspective, the average American worker at the time earned perhaps $300 a year. Cornelius's fortune represented the lifetime earnings of thousands of workers, and he was still accumulating, still competing, still winning. But even success brought new problems. When you're that wealthy, that powerful, you attract rivals who are equally ruthless. On the Nicaragua route, Cornelius found himself in conflict with Cornelius Garrison and Charles Morgan, business associates who tried to push him out of his own company through stock manipulation and political maneuvering. The battle was complex and bitter. Cornelius famously wrote to them, quote one, and he did, systematically destroying their competing route and reclaiming control of his company. The message was clear: you did not cross Cornelius Vanderbilt. His reputation by the mid-1850s was established and fearsome. He was known as the toughest, shrewdest, most relentless businessman in America. Politicians feared him because he could make or break their constituencies. Competitors avoided him when possible and approached negotiations with him very carefully. The press wrote about him constantly, sometimes admiringly for his business acumen, sometimes critically for his ruthless methods. He didn't care much what they wrote as long as they spelled his name correctly and acknowledged his power. Think for a moment about what it meant to be this wealthy and this powerful in the 1850s. The federal government was small and distant. Regulation of business was minimal. If you had the wealth and the will, you could operate almost like a sovereign power within your sphere. Cornelius bribed officials when useful, crushed competitors without legal constraint, manipulated stock prices without oversight. This was capitalism in its rawest form, before the reforms and regulations that would later moderate its excesses. It was the perfect environment for someone with Cornelius's particular genius and temperament. And yet, for all his millions, he still lived simply, still wore old clothes, still counted pennies on personal expenses even while he threw millions around in business deals. The contradiction was profound and revealing. He didn't want wealth to enjoy it in any conventional sense. He wanted it as proof that he was the best, the smartest, the toughest. Proof that the poor boy from Staten Island could beat anyone in the game of commerce. The money was how you kept score. By the late 1850s, Cornelius Vanderbilt was in his 60s, an age when most men of his era were dead or at least retired. He had accumulated a fortune estimated at between $10 and $15 million. He had built the largest steamship empire in America. He had proven everything he set out to prove. He could have stopped. He could have relaxed, enjoyed his wealth, spent time with his family, eased into old age. But that wasn't who he was. He was already looking ahead, already seeing the next transformation, already planning his most audacious move yet. Because steam technology wasn't just transforming water transportation, it was transforming land transportation too. Railroads were spreading across America like steel veins, connecting cities, opening the interior, creating new possibilities for commerce and empire. And Cornelius Vanderbilt in his 60s was about to pivot again, about to enter an entirely new industry, about to build his greatest fortune yet. The steamship era had made him rich. The railroad era would make him legendary. But we'll come to that. For now, rest with the image of the Commodore in his prime, 60-some years old, hard as iron, wealthy beyond most people's imagination but still hungry, still competitive, still absolutely convinced that he could conquer whatever he set his mind to. The fortune was growing, the pattern was established, and the greatest chapter was still to come. By the early 1860s, when most men his age were contemplating their mortality and settling their affairs, Cornelius Vanderbilt was contemplating his next empire. He was approaching 70 years old. By the standards of the 19th century, this was ancient. Life expectancy was perhaps 45 or 50 for someone who survived childhood. Men who reached 70 were rare, and men who reached 70 while still actively running businesses were rarer still. But Cornelius was not ready to retire. His body was aging. He suffered from various ailments, his hearing was failing, but his mind was as sharp and aggressive as ever. And he was looking at the railroads. Railroads had existed for decades by this point. The first American railroads were built in the 1830s, and by the 1860s they crisscrossed the eastern United States, carrying freight and passengers at speeds that would have seemed impossible a generation earlier. But the railroad industry was fragmented, chaotic, inefficient. Different companies operated different segments of routes. Tracks were different gauges, so cars couldn't move from one company's line to another's. Schedules were uncoordinated. The whole system was a mess of competing interests and incompatible infrastructure. Cornelius saw what others were too close to see. The future of American commerce wasn't on the water anymore. It was on rails. Ships were still important for ocean crossings and coastal trade, but for moving goods and people across the continent, railroads were the future. And more than that, he saw that whoever could consolidate and control the railroads, connecting New York City to the rest of the country, would control a choke point of American commerce. It would be like controlling New York Harbor, but bigger, more valuable, more powerful. So in the early 1860s, Cornelius began to sell his steamship empire. This wasn't a gradual transition. When he made decisions, he made them absolutely. He sold his ships, his routes, his hard-won competitive positions in the steamship business. He kept a few vessels for personal use, but the empire he'd spent decades building, he liquidated. And he took the millions he'd accumulated and began buying railroad stock. The timing was significant. The country was tearing itself apart in civil war. In April of 1861, Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter, and the Union and Confederacy began the bloodiest conflict in American history. For 4 years, from 1861 to 1865, the nation consumed itself in violence. Over 600,000 men died. Entire regions were devastated. The social and economic order of the South was destroyed. And yet, for the North's economy, and particularly for the railroads, the Civil War was a catalyst. The Union war effort depended on railroads to move troops, weapons, supplies, and food. The government poured money into railroad construction and paid premium rates for transportation. The railroad companies that served the Union cause prospered enormously, and Cornelius, with his usual sense of timing, was positioning himself to benefit. He began with the New York and Harlem Railroad, a line that ran from Manhattan up to Harlem and beyond. It wasn't the most prestigious railroad, but it had strategic value because it was one of the few railroads with tracks actually running onto Manhattan Island. Cornelius bought stock quietly at first, accumulating control. Then he used a technique that would become his signature move in the railroad business, the stock manipulation corner. Here's how it worked. Cornelius would quietly buy up as much stock as he could in a railroad. Meanwhile, he'd spread rumours or create situations that made the stock price fall. Other investors, particularly those who would quote to, meaning they'd sold stock they didn't own, betting the price would fall so they could buy it back cheaper, would pile in, selling more shares short. Then Cornelius would suddenly reverse course. He'd take some action that made the stock price shoot up. And all those short sellers would desperately need to buy stock to cover their positions. But Cornelius owned most of the available stock. They'd have to buy from him at whatever price he demanded. He would quote through the market, controlling the available supply, and extract enormous profits from the trapped short sellers. It was legal, barely, and it made him rich even by his already lofty standards. He did this with the Harlem Railroad, reportedly making millions in a single transaction. Then he did it again with the Hudson River Railroad, another line running north from Manhattan. Politicians who tried to interfere or who were complicit in schemes against him learned painful lessons. Cornelius's wealth gave him power, and he used that power without hesitation or remorse. By the mid-1860s, Cornelius controlled both the Harlem and Hudson lines. But his real target was bigger, the New York Central Railroad. This was the major trunk line running from New York City to Buffalo and connecting to lines that went all the way to Chicago and beyond. Control the New York Central, and you controlled access to New York City for freight and passengers coming from the entire western part of the country. It was the choke point he wanted. The New York Central was larger and more established than the lines he'd already acquired. Taking it over would require more than stock manipulation. It would require strategic thinking, political manoeuvring, and ruthless execution. Cornelius approached it systematically. He used his control of the Harlem and Hudson lines to create pressure. Freight that came into New York on the Central had to transfer to the Hudson to reach Manhattan. Cornelius made that transfer difficult and expensive. He strangled the Central's business until its directors were desperate to negotiate. In 1867, he won. He took control of the New York Central, merging it with his Hudson line, creating a unified system from New York to Buffalo. He was 73 years old, and he had just pulled off one of the great corporate consolidations of the era. He wasn't done. Over the next several years, Cornelius continued to consolidate and rationalize his railroad empire. He standardized gauges so cars could move seamlessly across different segments. He improved tracks and equipment. He built new stations, including the beginnings of what would become Grand Central Terminal in Manhattan. He negotiated with connecting lines to create through routes to Chicago and beyond. He was building a system, not just owning disconnected pieces of track. The profits were enormous. The railroads he controlled carried a huge share of the freight and passenger traffic between New York and the interior. He could set rates. He could give preferential treatment to shippers who paid him. He could strangle competitors. And he did all of these things without apology or hesitation. When critics accused him of monopolistic practices, of using his power unfairly, he was dismissive. There's a quote attributed to him from this era, probably apocryphal in its exact wording, but capturing his attitude perfectly. Law? What do I care about law? Ain't I got the power? Whether he said those exact words or not, they expressed his worldview. The law was something you used when it helped you and ignored or circumvented when it didn't. What mattered was power, economic power, political power, the power to make things happen regardless of what the rules said. And Cornelius had that power in abundance. The most famous battle of his railroad career came in the late 1860s, a conflict that became known as the Erie War. The Erie Railroad ran from New York to the Great Lakes, competing directly with Cornelius's New York Central. Cornelius decided he wanted to control the Erie too, creating an absolute monopoly on rail access to New York City from the west. But the Erie was controlled by a group of men who were nearly as ruthless and considerably more creative than Cornelius: Jay Gould, Jim Fisk, and Daniel Drew. The details of the Erie War are complex and bizarre, involving stock printing, court injunctions, legislators being bribed, and at one point the Erie directors fleeing across the Hudson River to New Jersey with millions of dollars in cash to escape arrest in New York. Let me walk through it slowly, because it's a remarkable story, even by the wild standards of 19th century American capitalism. Cornelius began buying Erie stock, planning to corner the market as he'd done before. But Gould, Fisk, and Drew had a counter-strategy. They simply printed more stock. They had control of the company and they issued new shares as fast as Cornelius bought existing ones. Cornelius poured millions into buying Erie stock, but the supply seemed endless because they were literally creating it. They were diluting the company's value, yes, harming other shareholders, but they didn't care. They were fighting for control and all tactics were acceptable. Cornelius got court orders to stop them. They got different judges to issue counter orders. Cornelius had politicians in New York. They fled to New Jersey, beyond the immediate reach of New York law, and set up headquarters in a hotel in Jersey City, surrounded by guards, conducting the Erie Railroad's business from exile, while simultaneously bribing New Jersey legislators to protect them. The stalemate lasted months. Both sides spent enormous sums on lawyers, bribes, stock purchases, and propaganda. The newspapers covered it breathlessly. The public watched in fascination as titans of commerce waged open war using every tool available, legal, illegal, and in between. Finally, a negotiated settlement was reached. Cornelius would abandon his attempt to take over the Erie. Gould and his partners would buy back the stock Cornelius had purchased at a price that gave him a small profit. Honour, in a perverse sense, was satisfied. Cornelius had lost. Sort of. He didn't get the Erie, but he proved that even he had limits, that there were battles not worth winning if the cost was too high. And he still controlled the most valuable railroad assets, the New York Central and its connected lines. The Erie remained a competitor, but a weakened one. And Jay Gould, who had fought Cornelius to a draw, earned a grudging respect. They remained rivals, but rivals who understood each other. Through all of this corporate warfare and empire building, Cornelius's personal life continued in its austere, emotionally distant pattern. His wife Sophia died in 1868, after 48 years of marriage. He married again within months to a much younger woman named Frank Crawford. His children, now adults, were horrified and contested the marriage. Cornelius didn't care. He did what he wanted. He always had. His relationship with his children remained troubled and transactional. He had 13 children who survived to adulthood, and he disapproved of most of them. His eldest son, William Henry Vanderbilt, was the one he trusted with business matters, though even that relationship was complicated by criticism and distance. Another son, Cornelius Jeremiah, struggled with gambling and epilepsy, and his father essentially disowned him. The daughters were married off to respectable men, given modest settlements, and largely ignored. The family gatherings, when they happened, were apparently tense affairs marked by resentment and competition for the old man's approval. But approval was scarce because Cornelius measured worth in terms of business acumen and toughness, and most of his children didn't measure up by his standards. They were, in his view, soft. They liked comfort and society and culture, things he regarded as frivolous. They didn't have the hunger, the edge, the absolute will to dominate that he possessed. Perhaps this was inevitable. They had grown up with money. They hadn't clawed their way up from a ferry boat. How could they understand? By the mid-1870s, Cornelius was in his 80s and finally slowly declining. His body was failing even as his empire reached its peak. The New York Central System was the most valuable railroad property in America. His fortune was estimated at around $100 million, an almost incomprehensible sum. To put it in perspective, the entire federal budget in 1870 was around $300 million. One man's fortune was a third the size of the government's annual spending. In modern terms, adjusting for the growth of the economy and accounting for the concentration of wealth, his fortune at his death was equivalent to something like $200 billion. He was, arguably, the richest American who had ever lived. He remained engaged with business almost to the end, receiving reports, making decisions, fighting competitors. But in his final months, he weakened rapidly. He died on January 4th, 1877, at his home in Manhattan. He was 82 years old. He had lived through the entire transformation of America from an agricultural republic to an industrial power. He had built an empire on water, and then on steel rails. He had accumulated wealth beyond anything his father could have imagined. And now he left behind the question that would shape the next generation of the Vanderbilt story. What would happen to all that money? The will, when it was read, shocked everyone except those who knew him well. Of his $100 million fortune, he left approximately $95 million to one son, William Henry Vanderbilt. To his other children he left relatively small bequests, a few $100,000 each. To his son Cornelius Jeremiah, the one with epilepsy and gambling problems, he left the income from a trust but no principal. The daughters received similar trusts, but the bulk, the overwhelming majority of the greatest fortune in American history, went to a single heir. His reasoning was clear, if harsh. The fortune represented his life's work, his victory in the great competition of commerce. It needed to be preserved and grown, not divided and scattered. Only William Henry had shown the capacity to manage it. Only William Henry had worked in the business, understood the railroads, demonstrated the necessary toughness. The others had proven themselves unworthy by Cornelius's standards, so they were cut out. The decision was ruthless, practical, and absolutely characteristic. Even in death, Cornelius was playing to win. He had built the fortune as one unified empire. He intended it to remain that way, concentrated in the hands of one capable heir who could preserve and extend it. Whether this would work, whether William Henry could bear the weight, whether the fortune could survive intact into the next generation, these questions were now his son's burden. Picture the moment. January 1877. The old Commodore finally still, the empire passing to new hands, the fortune intact but fragile in ways that weren't yet visible. $100 million, the work of a lifetime, the largest concentration of personal wealth in American history. And ahead, waiting in the future, the question we started with: how would it all disappear? The answer was already beginning to take shape, though no one could see it yet. Division was deferred, but only deferred. The spending hadn't yet begun, but the conditions that would enable it were being created. The fortune stood at its peak, and from peaks there is only one direction to go. The other children didn't accept their disinheritance quietly. Within days of Cornelius's death, the excluded children began consulting lawyers, preparing to challenge the will. They had grounds, or thought they did. How could a father in his right mind give everything to one child and almost nothing to the others? Surely this was evidence of mental incapacity, of undue influence, of something wrong that the courts should rectify. The battle lines were drawn for what would become one of the most public and bitter family disputes in American history. The will contest began in earnest in November of 1877, 10 months after Cornelius's death. The primary challenger was Cornelius Jeremiah Vanderbilt, the son who had been essentially disowned, left only with the income from a trust and no access to the principal. He sued to break the will, claiming his father had been mentally incompetent when it was written, that William Henry had exercised undue influence, that the entire document was the product of a diseased mind and a manipulative son. The trial was a sensation. This was the Gilded Age, an era when the public was fascinated by the wealthy, and here was the richest family in America washing their grievances in public. The newspapers covered every detail. Witnesses testified about Cornelius's mental state in his final years. Some said he'd been sharp until the end. Others claimed he'd been confused, irrational, subject to strange beliefs. His involvement in spiritualism, he'd consulted mediums trying to contact his dead wife Sophia, was presented as evidence of mental decline. His quick remarriage to a much younger woman was cited as proof of senility and vulnerability to manipulation. William Henry's lawyers countered with their own parade of witnesses. Business associates testified that Cornelius had been fully competent, that he'd made rational business decisions until very near the end. They argued that his distribution of the estate was completely logical. He'd given the fortune to the only child capable of managing it. The others had proven themselves unreliable or uninterested in business. Was it the act of a madman to give his life's work to the one son who had worked alongside him and demonstrated competence? The trial dragged on for months. Every aspect of the Vanderbilt family life was examined, every old resentment aired, every wound reopened. It was painful and humiliating, and it was all conducted in the glare of public attention. But ultimately the challengers lost. In March of 1879, the jury upheld the will. Cornelius had been competent. William Henry was the rightful heir to the fortune. The other children would receive only their modest bequests. Cornelius Jeremiah, the chief challenger, was devastated. 2 years later, in April of 1882, he shot himself in a hotel room. He was 51 years old. Whether his suicide was directly related to the will contest or to his broader struggles with epilepsy, gambling and depression, we can't know. But it was a tragic end to a tragic life, and it cast a shadow over the family victory. Let's turn our attention now to William Henry, because he's the hinge of the Vanderbilt story, the bridge between the empire-building generation and the spending generation, and he deserves to be understood on his own terms, not just as his father's son. William Henry Vanderbilt was born in 1821, when his father was still a ferry operator, still building his first small fortune in New York Harbor. He grew up watching his father work relentlessly, build the steamship empire, fight competitors, accumulate wealth. But William Henry was different from his father in temperament and inclination. Where Cornelius was aggressive and confrontational, William Henry was cautious and diplomatic. Where Cornelius was a fighter, William Henry was a manager. Where Cornelius built through conquest, William Henry would build through consolidation and efficiency. His father didn't appreciate these differences. For much of William Henry's early life, Cornelius regarded him as weak, as lacking the necessary edge for business. There's a story, possibly apocryphal but consistent with Cornelius's character, that when William Henry was struggling with a small farming operation his father had given him to manage, Cornelius told him he was a fool and would never amount to anything. Whether the exact words were spoken or not, the sentiment was real. Cornelius was disappointed in his eldest son, but William Henry persevered. He learned the railroad business from the ground up, working in various capacities in his father's companies, proving his competence gradually and quietly. He didn't have his father's flash or ruthlessness, but he had something else, a methodical intelligence, an attention to detail, a capacity for the patient work of administration and improvement. By the time Cornelius died, William Henry had been working in the railroad business for years. He understood the operations, he knew the people, he was ready even if his father had only grudgingly acknowledged it. When he inherited the fortune in 1877, William Henry was 56 years old. He had spent decades preparing for this moment, though perhaps not consciously. He took control of the New York Central and the other railroad properties with a clear vision. He would consolidate, streamline, and improve what his father had built. No dramatic expansion, no risky ventures, just solid, competent management that would preserve and ideally grow the wealth. And he succeeded brilliantly. This is the part of the story that often gets overlooked in the broader Vanderbilt narrative, but it's crucial. William Henry doubled the fortune. In just 8 years, from 1877 to 1885, he took the $100 million he inherited and grew it to nearly $200 million. He did this not through dramatic stock manipulations or corporate warfare, but through patient, intelligent management of the railroad empire. He consolidated redundant operations, cutting costs without cutting service. He invested in improvements to track and equipment, making the railroads more efficient and safer. He negotiated agreements with connecting lines, expanding the reach of the New York Central system without the expensive battles his father had fought. He raised rates where he could, always testing the market to find the maximum the traffic would bear. He managed the finances conservatively, avoiding debt, building reserves. He was everything his father had not been, cautious, diplomatic, focused on incremental improvement rather than conquest. But this success came at a cost. William Henry worked himself to exhaustion. The weight of managing the largest fortune in America, of proving himself worthy of his father's trust, of showing the siblings who had challenged the will that he deserved what he'd been given. All of this created enormous pressure. He worked long hours, worried constantly, carried the burden without complaint but also without relief. There was also the public pressure. Being the richest man in America in the 1880s meant being a target. The public's attitude toward great wealth was changing. The Gilded Age was an era of extremes, extraordinary wealth for a few, grinding poverty for many. Labour unrest was growing. Strikes were becoming common and sometimes violent, and the railroad barons were particularly visible targets because railroads touched everyone's lives and everyone knew the operators were making enormous profits. In 1882, William Henry gave an interview to a newspaper reporter that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The reporter asked him about running extra trains for the public benefit, even when they weren't profitable. William Henry's response, as quoted in the newspaper, was, "The public be damned. I'm working for my stockholders." The quote exploded into a scandal. "The public be damned" became a rallying cry for critics of corporate power and wealth inequality. It was cited in labour disputes, in political speeches, in newspaper editorials condemning the arrogance of the wealthy. William Henry protested that he had been misquoted, that what he'd actually said was more nuanced. But it didn't matter. The quote had a life of its own. It became the symbol of everything people resented about the robber barons, their indifference to public welfare, their focus on profit above all else, their apparent contempt for ordinary Americans. The irony is that William Henry was actually one of the more socially conscious of the railroad magnates. He paid his workers relatively well. He invested in safety improvements. He gave generously to charities and cultural institutions. But none of that mattered once quote 7 entered the public consciousness. He was tarred with the brush of arrogance and greed, and no amount of explanation or good works could remove it. The stress of managing the fortune, defending his reputation, and dealing with the constant public scrutiny wore him down. He was not a young man when he inherited. 56 was already old by the standards of the era, and the 8 years of intense work aged him rapidly. His health declined. He suffered from various ailments, none specifically life-threatening but collectively debilitating. He looked older than his years. Worn down by responsibility and worry, in December of 1885, while staying at his mansion in Manhattan, William Henry suffered a stroke. He died quickly, just 64 years old. He had managed the fortune for only 8 years, though in that time he had proven himself brilliantly. He had doubled the wealth. He had managed the railroad empire competently and profitably. He had vindicated his father's choice, shown his siblings that he was worthy, demonstrated that cautious management could be as effective as aggressive conquest. But the vindication came at the price of his health, and ultimately his life. His will was different from his father's in one crucial respect. He divided the fortune. Not equally among all his children, he wasn't that egalitarian, but he didn't concentrate everything in a single heir either. He had 8 children who survived to adulthood, and he split the bulk of the fortune among them, though with the 2 eldest sons, Cornelius II and William Kissam, receiving larger shares than the others. This seems generous and fair, especially compared to his father's ruthless concentration of wealth, and in human terms it probably was more equitable. But financially, economically, it represented a critical turning point. The $200 million fortune divided 8 ways meant each child received roughly $20 to $25 million. Still enormous sums, yes, each heir was individually one of the richest people in America. But the concentration was broken. The empire would no longer have a single controller, a single strategic vision, a single decision-maker. Think about what this meant. When Cornelius controlled the 100 million, he used it as a unified tool. He could deploy capital strategically, fight battles, make investments with the full weight of the fortune behind him. When William Henry controlled the 200 million, same principle. Unified control, strategic deployment, the fortune as a single entity. But when that 200 million was divided into 8 pieces, the dynamic changed fundamentally. Each heir now had their own priorities, their own interests, their own ideas about what to do with their share. Some wanted to continue in the railroad business. Others were more interested in social prominence, cultural pursuits, building mansions, entering society. There was no longer a unified Vanderbilt strategy, just 8 individual Vanderbilts making their own choices with their own portions of the family wealth, and crucially they were one generation further removed from the source. William Henry had known what it was like to be relatively poor, to work his way up, to earn his father's grudging respect. His children had grown up wealthy. They had never known want or struggle. They had been raised in privilege, educated in the best schools, introduced to society, taught that they were special. They knew intellectually that their grandfather had built the fortune from nothing, but they hadn't experienced that struggle. The money, to them, was simply there, a fact of their existence, not something that had to be fought for and protected. This generational distance from wealth creation is crucial to understanding what happened next, because what happened next over the following decades was that the spending began in earnest. The fortune had been built, it had been doubled, it had been divided, and now, in the hands of the 3rd generation, it would begin to disappear. Not quickly, not all at once, but steadily, inevitably, through a combination of division, consumption, taxation, and changing economic conditions. William Henry's death in 1885 marked the end of the building era and the beginning of the spending era. He had been the last Vanderbilt to grow the fortune. From this point forward, it would only shrink. But in 1885, that wasn't yet visible. The fortune stood at its absolute peak, $200 million, divided among 8 heirs, each fabulously wealthy, each ready to live the life that such wealth made possible. The Gilded Age was at its height. The mansions were about to be built. The great display was about to begin, and the slow erosion of the greatest fortune in American history was underway, though no one knew it yet. Rest with that image for a moment. William Henry, exhausted and vindicated, dying at 64, having proven himself and doubled his inheritance. The fortune intact, but divided, concentrated but scattered, at its peak but beginning its descent. The children, wealthy beyond measure, ready to step into their inheritances and their roles in Gilded Age society. Everything about to change, though in ways that wouldn't be visible for decades. The pattern established, the future written, though not yet lived. Let that settle. We'll continue soon, moving into the era of mansions and balls and the beautiful, terrible spending that would mark the beginning of the end. The children were finally free to spend. This is the crucial shift we need to understand. As long as Cornelius controlled the fortune, and then William Henry, there was a restraining force. The money was a tool for building empire, for competition, for winning the game of commerce. Personal spending was minimal, almost pathologically restrained. But when William Henry died in 1885 and the fortune was divided among his 8 children, that restraint disappeared. Each heir had their own fortune, $20 to $25 million, and they were free to use it as they wished. And what many of them wished, more than anything, was to establish themselves in the highest reaches of American society. The 1880s and 1890s were the peak of what Mark Twain had named the Gilded Age, an era of ostentatious display, of wealth flaunted rather than hidden, of competition played out not in corporate boardrooms, but in ballrooms and on the pages of society newspapers. And the Vanderbilt children of William Henry's generation were about to become the most visible players in this glittering, excessive, ultimately tragic game. Let's meet them, these 8 inheritors of America's greatest fortune, because each took a different path, and together they illustrate the varieties of wealth's effects on human lives. Cornelius Vanderbilt II was the eldest, born in 1843. He received the largest share of the inheritance and, like his father, was involved in managing the family railroad businesses. He was serious, dutiful, somewhat humorless, a man who felt the weight of the family name and tried to live up to it. He married Alice Claypool Gwynn, and together they would build some of the most spectacular houses of the era and raise 7 children in an atmosphere of wealth and expectation. William Kissam Vanderbilt, born in 1849, was different. He was charming, social, interested in yachts and horses and society more than business. He married Alva Erskine Smith, a woman from a family with social pretensions but limited wealth. Alva was ambitious, brilliant, ruthless in her social climbing, and she would become one of the most important figures in this part of the Vanderbilt story. Together, William Kay and Alva would force their way into the highest echelons of New York society, and then eventually destroy their own marriage in the process. Frederick William Vanderbilt, born in 1856, was quieter, more private. He had fewer children and less interest in public display, though he would build his own mansion and live the life of leisure that his fortune made possible. George Washington Vanderbilt, born in 1862, was the youngest son and perhaps the most cultured. He loved art, literature, architecture, and he spoke multiple languages. He would eventually build the largest private home in American history, a monument to aesthetic ambition that would nearly bankrupt even his enormous fortune to maintain. The daughters, Margaret, Emily, Florence, and Eliza, married well, as wealthy daughters were expected to do. Some married American industrialists and financiers. Others married European nobility, exporting Vanderbilt millions to prop up crumbling aristocratic estates in England and France. Their lives followed the pattern expected of wealthy women of their era: marriage, children, social obligations, charitable work, and private struggles that rarely made it into the public record. Together, these 8 people inherited $200 million in 1885. Within a generation, they would spend, invest, lose, and give away significant portions of it. But in the 1880s and 1890s, that future loss wasn't yet visible. What was visible was the most spectacular display of wealth America had yet seen. The display began with houses. Not just houses, mansions, palaces, monuments to wealth and ambition that would have made European royalty jealous. Let me describe them slowly, because they deserve to be seen in detail, these beautiful, excessive, ultimately doomed structures. The competition started on Fifth Avenue in Manhattan. This was where New York's wealthiest families built their townhouses, competing in an architectural arms race that transformed the avenue into a showcase of Gilded Age excess. The Vanderbilts were relative newcomers to this world. The Astors, the old merchant aristocracy, had long dominated New York society. Mrs. Caroline Astor, the imperious queen of New York's 400, the 400 families she deemed worthy of inclusion in high society, had not recognized the Vanderbilts as social equals. To her, they were new money, railroad money, not quite respectable despite their wealth. Alva Vanderbilt was determined to change that. In 1883, she and William Kay completed a mansion at 665th Avenue that was designed explicitly to overwhelm. The architect Richard Morris Hunt, who would become the preferred architect of the Vanderbilts, created a French Renaissance chateau, a palace that wouldn't have been out of place in the Loire Valley. The limestone facade was ornate with carved details. The interior featured a grand staircase, ballrooms, drawing rooms, a dining room that could seat dozens, all decorated with European tapestries, imported marble, gilded mouldings, and original artworks. The house cost $3 million to build and another $3 million to furnish. $3 million in 1883 dollars translates to something like $200 million in modern purchasing power, though even that doesn't capture it because you simply can't build houses like that anymore. The craftsmanship, the imported materials, the army of artisans. It represented a concentration of resources and labour that's almost impossible to replicate today. But the house was just the stage. The performance was the ball. In March of 1883, Alva threw a costume ball to inaugurate the mansion. She invited 1,200 guests, asking them to come in elaborate historical costumes. The preparation took weeks. People commissioned costumes from Europe, spending thousands of dollars on a single outfit they would wear for one evening. The competition to receive an invitation was fierce, and Alva wielded that social power with calculated precision. The climax of her strategy involved Mrs. Astor's daughter, Carrie Astor, who desperately wanted to attend. But Alva hadn't invited her. The reason, Alva explained when asked, was that Mrs. Astor had never called on Alva socially, had never recognized her as a social equal. Therefore Alva could not invite her daughter. The message was clear. If you want your daughter at this ball, you need to acknowledge me. Mrs. Astor capitulated. She made the social call. Alva graciously accepted and sent the invitation. And just like that, the Vanderbilts were admitted to the highest levels of New York society. The ball itself was spectacular by all accounts. The costumes, the decorations, the music, the supper that lasted until dawn. Newspapers covered every detail. The public read about it with fascination and, increasingly, resentment. While working families struggled to make ends meet, the wealthy were spending fortunes on a single party. But the ball was just the beginning. The mansion competition accelerated. Cornelius II and Alice built an even larger house at 5th Avenue and 57th Street, a massive structure that occupied an entire block. Inside were lavish rooms designed for entertaining on a scale that rivaled European palaces. The art collection alone was worth millions. The furnishings were museum quality. The maintenance required a staff of dozens, maids, butlers, footmen, cooks, groundskeepers, all working to maintain the house and support the family's lifestyle. Then there were the summer houses, because wealthy New Yorkers didn't stay in the city during the hot months. They retreated to Newport, Rhode Island, where they built what they called, quote, 8, but which were in fact enormous mansions overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. And here, the competition reached its most extreme expression. Cornelius II built the breakers in Newport. Completed in 1895. The name was modest, just a cottage by the ocean where the waves break on the shore. But the reality was a 70-room Italian Renaissance palazzo designed, again, by Richard Morris Hunt. The entrance hall was 50 feet high, the dining room could seat 34, the morning room was decorated with platinum leaf. The great hall featured marble columns, gilded ceilings, crystal chandeliers that each weighed a ton. Every detail was imported, custom-made. Absurdly luxurious. The cost was $7 million to build, plus furnishings that added millions more. In 1895 dollars, this represented an almost incomprehensible sum. The house required a staff of 50 just to operate, not even counting the groundskeepers who maintained the 13 acres of manicured lawns and gardens. The heating system alone, necessary for the few months of the year the house might be occupied, cost thousands of dollars annually. The property taxes. As Newport began to wake up to the revenue potential of taxing great estates, would eventually become a significant burden. But in the 1890s, those future costs weren't yet visible or concerning. The breakers was a triumph, a statement, a monument to Vanderbilt wealth and taste. Visitors walked through in awe. Society pages described every room in detail. The house became synonymous with Gilded Age excess at its peak. Not to be outdone, Alva Vanderbilt built Marble House just down the road from the breakers. This was completed in 1892 and, as the name suggests, was constructed with extraordinary quantities of marble. Rare marbles imported from Italy and Africa, different colours and patterns in different rooms, a geological display as much as a house. The ballroom was covered in gold leaf. The Chinese tea house in the garden was an architectural fantasy, a place for afternoon gatherings that looked like something from an emperor's palace. Marble House cost $11 million, though much of that was Alva's money from her divorce settlement from William Kay. They divorced in 1895 in a scandal that shocked even jaded Gilded Age society. But before the divorce, while they were still married and building houses, Alva poured Vanderbilt millions into creating her vision of what wealth should look like. And what it looked like was marble and gold and mirrors and crystal. Rooms so opulent they barely seemed real. Spaces designed not for comfort or human warmth, but for display and overwhelming visual impact. George Vanderbilt took a different approach. He wasn't interested in the social competition of Fifth Avenue and Newport. He wanted something else. A private retreat, a place of beauty and culture away from the social battlefield. He found it in the mountains of North Carolina near Asheville, where he began in 1889 to build Biltmore Estate. Biltmore was different in scale and intent from the other Vanderbilt houses. It wasn't a townhouse or a summer cottage. It was a European-style country estate, a chateau with 250 rooms set in the middle of a 125,000-acre estate. George hired Richard Morris Hunt for the architecture and the great landscape architect Frederick Law Olmsted to design the grounds. They created something extraordinary, a French Renaissance castle in the Blue Ridge Mountains surrounded by gardens, forests and farmland. The house itself was staggering. 250 rooms, including 35 bedrooms, 43 bathrooms, 65 fireplaces, 3 kitchens, a bowling alley, a swimming pool, a library with 10,000 volumes. The banquet hall was 75 feet long with a ceiling 70 feet high. The pipe organ in the music room was one of the finest in America. The electrical system was state-of-the-art for the 1890s. The house had its own refrigeration plant, its own power generation, its own water system. George filled it with art and books and beautiful objects from his travels in Europe. He employed a permanent staff of hundreds to maintain the house and work the estate. He built a model village for the workers, a dairy, sawmills, and a working farm that was meant to demonstrate modern agricultural methods. Biltmore was George's vision of enlightened wealth, not just opulent display, but cultural achievement, agricultural improvement, a kind of benevolent feudalism transplanted to America. The cost was never precisely calculated, but estimates suggest something around $6 million for construction plus enormous ongoing costs for maintenance, staff and operations. Even George's fortune, $20-some million, was strained by Biltmore's appetite for cash. But in the 1890s, he could afford it. The money seemed endless. The future seemed secure. All of these houses, all of this display represented a fundamental shift in how the Vanderbilts related to their wealth. Cornelius had built wealth to have power in commerce. William Henry had built wealth to prove himself worthy. But this third generation was building wealth into objects, houses that were themselves worth millions, that required ongoing millions to maintain. That generated no income and served no purpose except to demonstrate that you could afford to build and maintain them. The houses were beautiful, yes, genuinely extraordinary achievements of architecture and craftsmanship, but they were also liabilities, drains on capital, monuments to consumption rather than production. The social season during these years followed a predictable pattern. Winter in the Fifth Avenue mansions in New York, with a constant round of dinners, balls, an opera. Spring might mean travel to Europe, buying art and furnishings, staying at the finest hotels. Summer in Newport with yachting, beach outings and more balls and dinners. Fall back in New York or perhaps at a country estate. The wealthy Vanderbilts moved through this social calendar surrounded by servants, wearing clothes that cost more than most families earned in a year, eating meals that would have fed a tenement building, all while the press reported their activities and the public read with a mixture of fascination and growing anger. The balls and parties of this era became legendary. The James Hazen Hyde Ball in 1906, for instance, wasn't even a Vanderbilt party, but they attended, and it gives a sense of the era. A ball that cost $200,000 for a single evening, with the ballroom of a hotel transformed to look like the gardens of Versailles. With costumes and champagne and an endless parade of excess, the Vanderbilts threw their own parties of similar scale, spending fortunes for a few hours of entertainment. But underneath the glitter, there were human costs. The marriages were often unhappy. Alva and William Kay's spectacular divorce was the most public, but others struggled privately. The pressure of maintaining social position, of competing with other wealthy families, of living up to the family name, created strain and unhappiness. The children of these wealthy Vanderbilts grew up in an atmosphere of privilege but also of expectation and competition that warped normal development. Some of the Vanderbilts tried to maintain involvement in the railroad businesses, but increasingly the fortunes were managed by professional managers and lawyers and bankers, not by the heirs themselves. The heirs were occupied with society, with their houses, with their yachts and horses and art collections. The businesses that generated the wealth became background noise, sources of dividends and income that funded the lifestyle, but didn't require or receive much attention from the family members who owned them. And crucially, the railroad industry itself was changing. The 1890s saw the rise of new forms of transportation, electric streetcars and, on the horizon, automobiles. The dominance of railroads was not yet seriously challenged, but the seeds of disruption were planted. The Vanderbilt fortune was built on transportation technology, and when that technology became less dominant, the fortune would be vulnerable. But in the 1890s, this was barely visible. The railroads were still enormously profitable. The dividends still flowed. The lifestyle seemed sustainable. Think about the contrast between Cornelius on his ferry in 1810 and his grandchildren in their palaces in the 1890s. 80 years, 3 generations, from a boat on New York Harbor to the breakers in Biltmore and Marble House. From wearing old clothes and counting pennies to spending millions on a house you'd occupy a few weeks a year. The transformation was total, almost incomprehensible. And built into that transformation, invisible to those living through it, was the mechanism of the fortune's eventual disappearance, because wealth divided is wealth diminished, and wealth spent on assets that consume rather than produce is wealth that will eventually exhaust itself. The houses were beautiful. The balls were spectacular. The lifestyle was everything that wealth could buy. But it was also the beginning of the end, though no one could see it yet. The fortune stood at $200 million, divided among 8 heirs, further divided among their children, being spent on houses and parties and objects that would depreciate and consume and eventually have to be sold. The pattern was set, the trajectory was established. And the Gilded Age gleamed and glittered, beautiful and doomed, a moment of perfect excess before the reckoning began. The new century arrived, and with it the slow recognition that the world the Vanderbilts had dominated was changing in ways they couldn't control. 1900 marked a symbolic turning point, though no one could have identified it as such at the time. The Gilded Age was reaching its end, though the glitter hadn't yet dimmed. The Vanderbilt mansion still stood proud on Fifth Avenue and in Newport. The parties continued. The social season followed its established rhythms. But underneath the familiar patterns, something fundamental was shifting. Other fortunes were rising, fortunes that made even the Vanderbilt wealth seem almost modest by comparison. John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil empire had created wealth that dwarfed what Cornelius had accumulated. By the early 1900s, Rockefeller was worth somewhere around $1 billion, 10 times the Vanderbilt fortune at its peak, before it was divided. Andrew Carnegie had sold his steel company to J.P. Morgan in 1901 for $480 million, making him personally richer than all the Vanderbilts combined. The currency of wealth itself was changing. The great fortunes of the new century were built not on transportation or trade, but on oil, steel, banking, and industrial production. The railroads, the foundation of Vanderbilt wealth, were mature industries now. They were still profitable, yes, still essential to American commerce, but they weren't the future anymore. The future was in new technologies, new industries, new forms of organization and capital deployment. The Vanderbilts, with their wealth tied to railroad stocks and real estate, were becoming yesterday's rich people. More immediately threatening, the railroads themselves faced new competition. In 1903, Henry Ford founded the Ford Motor Company. Within a decade, automobiles were transforming from expensive toys for the wealthy into practical transportation for the middle class. Ford's Model T, introduced in 1908 and mass-produced starting in 1913, made car ownership accessible to ordinary Americans. Roads were being paved, gas stations were appearing, the whole infrastructure of automobile transportation was emerging, and every car sold was one less train ticket purchased, one less freight shipment sent by rail. The Vanderbilts, or at least some of them, tried to adapt. They invested in automobile companies, in new technologies, but their hearts, and more importantly their capital, remained tied to the railroads. That's where the family wealth had been built. That's what they understood. And so they stayed mostly invested in an industry whose best days were behind it, earning dividends that were still substantial, but no longer growing, no longer dominant. Meanwhile, the fortune continued to divide. William Henry's 8 children had children of their own, dozens of grandchildren of William Henry, great-grandchildren of the Commodore. Each generation saw the wealth split again. If you start with 200 million and divide it 8 ways, each heir gets 25 million. Then those 8 have children. Let's say each has 4 children on average, which is conservative for that era. Now you have 32 people sharing what had been 200 million. Each gets a bit more than 6 million. Still wealthy, certainly, but no longer commanding the kind of capital that could dominate industries or drive national economic policy. And this assumes the capital remains intact, which it didn't. The mansions consumed wealth at a staggering rate. Let's think about what it cost to maintain a house like the Breakers. You needed 50 servants working full-time, Maids, butlers, footmen, cooks, laundresses, groundskeepers each had to be paid, housed, fed. The heating system required enormous amounts of coal in winter. The house had to be cleaned constantly. Those marble floors and gilded ceilings and crystal chandeliers didn't maintain themselves. Repairs were ongoing and expensive because everything was custom-made, irreplaceable. When something broke, you couldn't just buy a new one. You had to have it specially manufactured by craftsmen who understood 19th century techniques. The property taxes were rising too. This was the Progressive Era, a period of reform and regulation aimed at curbing the excesses of the Gilded Age. Cities and states, responding to public pressure and needing revenue, began taxing the great estates more aggressively. In Newport, the property taxes on the breakers went from a few $1,000s a year in the 1890s to tens of thousands by the 1910s. This was still manageable for wealthy Vanderbilts, but it was a drain, a constant outflow that generated no return. And in 1913, a development occurred that would fundamentally alter the relationship between wealth and taxation in America. The 16th Amendment was ratified, allowing the federal government to levy an income tax. The first rates were modest, 7% on income over $500,000, but the precedent was established. For the first time, the wealthy would pay a percentage of their income directly to the federal government every year. The era of accumulating wealth without significant taxation was over. The Vanderbilts, like other wealthy families, had to adjust. They hired accountants and lawyers to manage their tax obligations, to find legal ways to minimize their burdens. Trusts became more sophisticated. Money was moved into tax-advantaged investments. But the fundamental reality remained. A portion of income was now going to taxes rather than being reinvested or spent as the family chose. The ability to accumulate wealth was constrained in new ways. Then came the war. World War I, beginning in Europe in 1914 and drawing in the United States in 1917, changed American society in profound ways. The war itself didn't directly harm the Vanderbilts financially. Some of them actually profited from war-related investments. But the social and cultural changes the war brought were significant. The ostentatious display that had characterized the Gilded Age began to seem inappropriate in wartime. Young men from wealthy families enlisted or were drafted, serving alongside working-class soldiers, experiencing a kind of social mixing that was unusual in peacetime. Women took jobs in factories and offices, stepping into roles that had been closed to them. The entire social order was shaken. And when the war ended in 1918, the world that emerged was different. The old certainties were gone. The respect for established hierarchies was diminished. The tolerance for excessive displays of wealth, while others had sacrificed, was reduced. Some Vanderbilts tried to maintain business involvement, particularly those who had inherited large stakes in the railroad companies. But increasingly, the businesses were run by professional managers while the family members collected dividends and lived as rentiers, people whose income comes from investments rather than active work. This was a comfortable life, but also a purposeless one for many. Without the drive to build or compete, without meaningful work to occupy their time, some Vanderbilts drifted into lives of leisure and dissipation. Harold Sterling Vanderbilt, great-grandson of the Commodore, was emblematic in some ways of this generation. He was wealthy, well-educated, cultured. He raced yachts and won the America's Cup multiple times, and he invented contract bridge, the card game that would become the most popular in the world. This was a genuine achievement, a contribution to culture, but it was also symbolic. Instead of building railroads or creating businesses, the Vanderbilt heirs were inventing card games and racing yachts. The energy had turned from production to consumption, from building to enjoying. The marriages to European nobility, which had seemed so glamorous in the 1890s, proved to be expensive in the long run. Consuelo Vanderbilt, daughter of Alva and William Kay, was essentially forced by her mother to marry the Duke of Marlborough in 1895. The marriage brought Alva the satisfaction of having a daughter who was a duchess, and it brought the Duke a massive infusion of Vanderbilt money to maintain Blenheim Palace, his ancestral estate in England. But it was miserable for Consuelo, trapped in a loveless marriage, and it drained millions of dollars out of the family and out of America to support English aristocracy. Other Vanderbilt daughters and granddaughters made similar marriages, each taking their portions of the fortune with them to Europe. Some of these marriages were happy, others were disasters. But all of them represented capital leaving the family's control, being spent to maintain foreign estates, to support lifestyles in European capitals, to satisfy social ambitions that had nothing to do with preserving or growing wealth. The 1920s brought a brief renaissance of sorts. The economy boomed, the stock market soared. The Vanderbilts, with their substantial investments, saw their wealth grow on paper. Some younger Vanderbilts tried to be modern, to engage with the new economy, to invest in exciting new industries like radio and aviation. There were moments when it seemed the family might reclaim its position at the pinnacle of American wealth. But the underlying challenges were still there and growing. The mansions were becoming increasingly difficult to staff and maintain. Domestic servants, who had been plentiful and cheap in the Gilded Age, were finding other employment opportunities in the expanding economy. Young women who might once have worked as maids were taking jobs in offices and shops. The wages required to attract and keep good servants were rising, and the work itself, maintaining these enormous houses, was becoming seen as old-fashioned, as belonging to an earlier era. Some of the houses began to close, not permanently at first, just for parts of the year. A family might decide to spend the summer travelling in Europe instead of opening the Newport house, because the cost and effort of opening the house for just a few months didn't seem worth it. Or they might close off wings of the Fifth Avenue mansion, living in just a portion of the house, because heating and staffing the whole thing was too expensive. The sales began quietly at first. Art collections that had been assembled at great expense in the 1890s were sold to museums or other collectors. Furniture, tapestries, decorative objects, things that had cost fortunes to acquire, and that now, in changed circumstances, seemed more like burdens than treasures. The sales were conducted discreetly, through dealers and auction houses, but they were signs of a shift. The accumulation was over, the dispersal had begun, property taxes continued to rise. The cities and towns where the Vanderbilt mansion stood recognized that these properties represented enormous potential revenue. Newport particularly began raising assessments and tax rates on the great cottages. The breakers, which had cost $7 million to build in 1895, was assessed for property tax purposes at values that made the annual tax bill staggering. Cornelius Vanderbilt II's widow Alice found herself paying property taxes of hundreds of thousands of dollars a year on properties that generated no income and that she used only occasionally. The arithmetic was beginning to work against the Vanderbilts. The railroad dividends were substantial but not growing. The tax obligations were rising. The maintenance costs were increasing. The capital was being divided among more and more heirs. And the opportunities to rebuild the fortune, to replicate what Cornelius and William Henry had done in their eras, were less available. The industries that were creating new wealth, oil, steel, automobiles, electric power, were already dominated by other families who had gotten there first. Some individual Vanderbilts did well for themselves. They made good investments, managed their inheritances prudently, lived comfortable if not spectacular lives. But as a family, as a unified fortune, the Vanderbilts were in decline. The name still commanded respect. The social position was still elevated. Invitations to Vanderbilt events were still prized. But the reality underneath the glittering surface was changing. Picture Fifth Avenue in the mid-1920s. The Vanderbilt mansion still stood, limestone palaces among the commercial buildings that were increasingly replacing the old residential structures. Inside, fewer servants moved through the vast rooms. Some of the furniture was gone, sold or moved to smaller properties. The art on the walls was sometimes second-tier pieces, the masterworks having been quietly sold. The families that occupied these houses were still wealthy, still living lives of privilege that most Americans couldn't imagine. But they were not what they had been. The peak had passed. And ahead, unseen but approaching, was a catastrophe that would accelerate everything, that would take the slow decline and turn it into a precipitous fall. The stock market, which had soared through the 1920s, creating paper wealth and confidence, was building toward a crash that would rival the one that had launched Cornelius's railroad career. But this time, the Vanderbilts wouldn't be positioned to profit from the chaos. This time, they would be among its victims. The Great Depression was coming, and when it arrived, it would hammer the final nails into the coffin of the great Vanderbilt fortune. The mansions would become impossible to maintain. The railroad stocks would plummet. The whole elaborate structure of wealth and display that had been built over 3 generations would crack and crumble. But we'll come to that. For now, rest with the image of the late 1920s, the mansion still standing but emptier, the fortune still substantial but shrinking, the family still prominent but fading. The beginning of the end was well underway, visible to anyone who looked carefully, though most preferred not to look. The Golden Age was over, the reckoning was approaching, and nothing could stop what was coming. October of 1929 arrived like any other autumn in America. The leaves turning, the air cooling, the rhythm of the year moving forward as it always had. And then, suddenly, it didn't. The stock market had been soaring through the 1920s, reaching heights that seemed to prove America had entered a new era of permanent prosperity. The Vanderbilts, like most wealthy families, had substantial investments in stocks, railroad stocks primarily, but also holdings in other industries. On paper, their wealth had grown significantly through the decade. The future looked secure, or at least it seemed that way until Thursday, October 24th, when the selling began. We've walked through the Great Depression before in these quiet conversations, so you know the pattern. Black Thursday, brief recovery, then Black Tuesday on October 29th when the bottom truly fell out. 16 million shares traded that day, billions of dollars in wealth vanishing in hours. The ticker tape running hours behind, investors selling blind in panic. The whole structure of paper wealth collapsing under its own weight. For the Vanderbilts, the crash was devastating in ways both immediate and slow-burning. Their railroad stocks plummeted. The New York Central, which had been the crown jewel of the family empire, saw its stock price collapse from over $200 a share to under $10 within 3 years. If you held $1 million in Central stock in October of 1929, by 1932 you had less than $50,000. The paper wealth that had seemed so solid, so permanent, evaporated. But unlike many Americans who lost everything in the crash, the Vanderbilts still had real assets. They had the mansions, the art collections, the land. The problem was that those assets, which had once been demonstrations of wealth, now revealed themselves as liabilities. The mansions didn't generate income, they consumed it. And in a depression, when money itself was scarce and getting scarcer, that consumption became unbearable. Think about the arithmetic of maintaining the breakers during the Depression. The house still needed its staff of 50, though perhaps they could cut to 40 or 35 if they closed off some sections. Those servants still needed to be paid, though wages could be reduced since unemployment was so high that people were desperate for any job. The heating system still required coal, tons of it, to keep those vast spaces from freezing. The roof still needed repairs when it leaked. The ground still needed maintenance. The property taxes still came due every year. Alice Vanderbilt, Cornelius II's widow, was living in the breakers through the early years of the Depression. She had inherited her husband's fortune when he died in 1912, and she had managed it conservatively, as women of her generation and class were taught to do. But conservative management meant investing in supposedly safe, reliable assets like railroad stocks and real estate. When the Depression hit, those safe assets proved vulnerable. Her income from railroad dividends dropped precipitously as the companies struggled. Her real estate investments lost value as property prices fell. And yet the expenses of maintaining the breakers and the other family properties continued unabated. The property taxes on the breakers alone were running around $28,000 a year by the early 1930s. To put that in perspective, the median American family income in 1933 was about $1,200. The property tax on one house was equivalent to the annual income of more than 20 families. And that was just the tax, not the maintenance, not the staff, not the utilities. The house was consuming wealth at a rate that even a Vanderbilt fortune couldn't sustain indefinitely. Alice tried to hold on. The breakers represented her husband's achievement, her family's position, her own identity in many ways, but the numbers were inexorable. In 1938, she leased the breakers to the Preservation Society of Newport County for $1 a year, effectively giving up control while retaining technical ownership. It was admission of defeat, a recognition that the house had become too expensive to maintain as a private residence. The pattern repeated across the family holdings. The Fifth Avenue mansions, those monuments to Gilded Age ambition, became impossible to sustain. The commercial value of the land they occupied far exceeded their value as residences, particularly in a depression when maintaining such houses was so difficult. One by one, they were sold. Cornelius II's enormous mansion at Fifth Avenue and 57th Street, the one that occupied an entire block, was demolished in 1926, actually before the Depression, to make way for the Bergdorf Goodman department store. The symbolism was stark. The grandest private residence in New York City torn down to make room for retail. The Vanderbilts who had built the house were paid handsomely for the land, but the house itself, which had cost millions to build and furnish, was worth nothing except as an impediment to commercial development. William K. Vanderbilt's house, the one Alva had built for their famous 1883 ball, was sold and demolished in 1926 as well. The contents were auctioned off: furniture, tapestries, artworks, all the beautiful objects that had cost fortunes to acquire now scattered to various buyers, the collection broken up, the vision destroyed. By the mid-1930s, most of the great Vanderbilt mansions in Manhattan were gone or in the process of being sold. The land was too valuable. Where the house is too expensive to maintain, the era they represented too thoroughly over. New York was becoming a modern city of skyscrapers and commercial buildings. The residential palaces of the Gilded Age didn't fit anymore, physically or culturally. They were torn down, replaced by structures that generated revenue, that served modern purposes that belonged to a different age. In Newport, some houses survived by becoming museums or institutions. The breakers, as we've noted, was leased and eventually sold to the Preservation Society. Marble House followed a similar path. They were maintained not as residences but as historical artifacts, monuments to an era of excess that Americans now viewed with a mixture of fascination and disapproval. You could pay admission to walk through the breakers, to see how the wealthy had lived, to marvel at the opulence, and perhaps to reflect on how thoroughly that world had vanished. George Vanderbilt's Biltmore estate faced its own crisis. The house was even larger than the breakers, even more expensive to maintain. And unlike the Newport cottages, which were seasonal residences, Biltmore was meant to be year-round, requiring constant staffing and maintenance. George had died in 1914, leaving the estate to his widow Edith and daughter Cornelia. They struggled through the Depression years to keep it running. The estate was partially sustained by its working farms and forestry operations, which generated some income, but the house itself was a constant drain. Wings were closed off, staff was reduced. Cornelia and her mother lived in just a portion of the vast structure, the rest left dark and cold to save on heating. They sold off some of the art and furnishings, sacrificing pieces of the collection to generate cash to maintain what remained. The decision was eventually made to open Biltmore to tourists, charging admission for people to tour the house and grounds. This was in 1930, and it represented a fundamental shift. The house that George had built as a private retreat, a place of beauty and culture away from the world, was now a commercial enterprise. Strangers walked through the rooms, gawked at the furnishings, took photographs. It was humiliating in some ways, but it was also necessary. The admission fees helped pay for maintenance. The house survived, though not as George had intended. The art collections that had been assembled so carefully and at such expense in the Gilded Age were gradually dispersed. The Metropolitan Museum of Art, the National Gallery and other institutions acquired Vanderbilt artworks, sometimes as gifts, but more often as purchases from family members who needed cash. The collections that had been intended to stay in the family, to be passed down through generations, were broken up and scattered. Each sale represented both financial necessity and cultural loss. Some Vanderbilts tried to maintain business involvement to generate income rather than just consuming inherited capital. But the Depression made this difficult. The railroad industry was struggling badly. Passenger traffic had fallen as people couldn't afford to travel. Freight traffic was down because the whole economy had contracted. The railroads that had been profit machines for decades were now barely breaking even or running losses. Dividends were cut or eliminated. Stock values remained depressed. The newer industries that might have offered opportunities for rebuilding the fortune were already dominated by others. The automobile industry was controlled by Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler. The oil industry belonged to Rockefeller's successors. Steel was Morgan and Carnegie's legacy. Banking was being transformed by regulation and consolidation. The niches where a new Vanderbilt might have built an empire simply weren't available in the way they had been for Cornelius and William Henry. Some Vanderbilt descendants, finding themselves without sufficient income from their inheritances, took jobs, regular jobs. Not executive positions handed to them because of their name, but actual employment where they had to show up and work and earn their pay. This was shocking to the older generation, accustomed to living on inherited wealth. But for the younger Vanderbilts coming of age during the Depression, working for a living was becoming necessary. The irony was not lost on observers. Here were descendants of the Commodore, the man who had built one of the greatest fortunes in history specifically so his children wouldn't have to work, going to offices and taking salaries. The fortune that was meant to last forever, to sustain the family in perpetuity, had lasted less than a century before some family members needed employment. World War II, when it came in 1941, provided a temporary reprieve for some aspects of the economy. The war effort required massive production, and some Vanderbilt investments benefited. The railroads were crucial to moving troops and war material, and the government paid well for their services. Some railroad stocks recovered partially, but the fundamental trajectory wasn't changed. The brief wartime boost delayed but didn't prevent the ongoing dispersal of the fortune. The war also accelerated social changes that made the old Vanderbilt world even more obsolete. Millions of Americans served in the military, experiencing social mixing and mobility. Women worked in factories and offices in unprecedented numbers. The old class division softened. The tolerance for displays of inherited wealth diminished further. When the war ended in 1945, America was a different country than it had been in 1929, let alone in 1877 when the Commodore died. By the late 1940s and early 1950s, the Great Dispersal was essentially complete. Most of the mansions were gone, sold or converted to other uses or demolished. The art collections were scattered. The concentrated Vanderbilt holdings in the railroads were diluted through sales and estate settlements. The family members who remained wealthy were individually comfortable, but no longer commanding the kind of capital that could shape industries or national policy. Some family members tried to maintain the old standards, hosting parties, summering in Newport in the houses that remained, insisting on formal dress and elaborate protocols. But it was increasingly a performance, a ritual maintained out of habit and nostalgia, rather than from genuine social power. The world had moved on. The Vanderbilts were becoming historical curiosities, reminders of an era that seemed very distant despite being only a few decades past. The railroad empire that Cornelius had built and that had sustained the family for 3 generations was fracturing and changing. The New York Central merged with other lines, diluting the Vanderbilt connection. Professional managers ran the company. The Vanderbilt name on the board of directors was eventually more symbolic than substantive. By the 1960s, the railroad itself would merge again and eventually go bankrupt, the proud Central reduced to a component of a failing conglomerate. Looking back from the 1950s, the arc was clear. From the ferry boat to the greatest fortune in America, to dispersal and decline in just 3 generations, barely a century. The Commodore had died in 1877 worth $100 million. William Henry had died in 1885 worth $200 million. By 1950, there wasn't a single Vanderbilt who commanded even a fraction of that wealth. The fortune had been divided, spent, taxed, lost and scattered until it was no longer a fortune at all, just the comfortable inheritances of numerous descendants. The Depression had been the catalyst, the event that turned slow decline into rapid collapse. But the Depression alone didn't destroy the Vanderbilt fortune. The fortune was vulnerable because of how it had been managed in the 3rd generation, because of the division, because of the consumption, because of the shift from building wealth to displaying it. The Depression exposed those vulnerabilities and accelerated trends that were already underway. Picture the early 1950s. Perhaps a family gathering of the Vanderbilt descendants. They would still recognize each other as family, still share the famous name, still have some family resemblance to the old Commodore. But they were scattered across the country and the world, pursuing various careers and lives. Connected by blood and history, but not by any unified fortune or purpose. The empire was gone. The mansions were mostly gone. The fortune that had seemed eternal had proven as mortal as the men who built it. And ahead, in the coming decades, the final dispersal would continue until the Vanderbilt name meant only history, not wealth. But we'll explore that. For now, rest with the image of empire's end, of mansions falling, of a fortune scattering like leaves in autumn wind, beautiful and sad and inexorable. The question we started with was simple. Where did it all go? $200 billion, the equivalent purchasing power of the Commodore's fortune in modern terms. The greatest concentration of private wealth in American history. How does something that vast simply disappear? In 1973, nearly a century after Cornelius's death, the Vanderbilt family held a reunion. 120 descendants of the Commodore gathered together, connected by blood and by that famous name. And of those 120 people, not a single one was a millionaire. Not one. The fortune that had once been so vast it exceeded the Federal Treasury had dispersed so thoroughly that within 3 generations it had essentially vanished. This fact is stark and shocking, and it demands explanation. So let's walk through it carefully, piecing together where the money went, understanding the mechanisms that transformed one of the world's great fortunes into comfortable but unremarkable inheritances scattered among dozens of descendants. The first and most fundamental mechanism was division. This is simply mathematics. But the mathematics are relentless and powerful. Cornelius left $100 million to William Henry in 1877. William Henry doubled it to $200 million by 1885. Then he divided it 8 ways among his children. Each child received approximately $20 to $25 million. Still an enormous fortune by any measure. Each of William Henry's children was individually one of the richest people in America. But then those 8 had children of their own. Let's be conservative and say each of the 8 had an average of 4 children who survived to adulthood. That's realistic for that era. Families were large, though infant mortality meant not all children survived. So 32 people in the 3rd generation, the great-grandchildren of the Commodore, sharing what had originally been $200 million. If the capital had remained intact, each would inherit about $6 million. Still wealthy, certainly, but no longer commanding the kind of capital that shapes industries. Then those 32 had children, the fourth generation, the great-great-grandchildren. If each of those 32 had 3 children on average, that's 96 people in the fourth generation. If the original 200 million had remained intact and been divided equally among them, each would inherit about $2 million. Comfortable? Yes. But not wealthy in any extraordinary sense, particularly by the mid-20th century, when $2 million, while substantial, didn't place you among America's richest families. But of course, the capital didn't remain intact. And that brings us to the second major mechanism, spending. The third generation, the grandchildren of the Commodore, spent money at a rate and on a scale that was breathtaking, even by Gilded Age standards. Let's try to calculate roughly what the mansions cost, because these are the most visible and dramatic expenditures. The breakers, $7 million to build, perhaps another $3 million to furnish, $10 million total in $1895. Marble House, $11 million. Cornelius II's Fifth Avenue mansion, estimated $8 to $10 million to build and furnish. Biltmore, at least $6 million for the house, plus enormous cost for the grounds and supporting structures, probably $10 to $12 million total. And these are just the most famous ones. There were other houses, other estates, other properties. Add them all up, and the Vanderbilts of William Henry's generation probably spent $40 to $50 million just building and furnishing houses. Then the annual costs of maintaining them. Let's be conservative and estimate that maintaining the major Vanderbilt properties cost collectively about $2 million a year in ongoing expenses. Staff, utilities, repairs, property taxes, all of it. Over 30 years from 1885 to 1915, that's $60 million consumed in maintenance, not generating any return, just consuming capital to maintain structures that were essentially monuments to wealth. Then there were the parties, the costumes, the yachts, the art collections, the European travel, all the conspicuous consumption that defined Gilded Age life. This is harder to calculate precisely, but if you assume the major Vanderbilt families were spending, collectively, another $1 million or $2 million a year on lifestyle beyond house maintenance. Over those same 30 years, you're talking about another $30 to $60 million. So just in the period from 1885 to 1915, rough estimates suggest the family spent something like $150 million on houses and lifestyle. That's 3/4 of the original $200 million fortune, consumed in 30 years of spectacular display. The third mechanism was taxation, and this became increasingly significant in the 20th century. Before 1913, there was no federal income tax. Estate taxes were minimal or non-existent. But after the 16th Amendment established the income tax, and particularly after the tax rates were raised dramatically during World War I and the Depression, taxation became a major drain on accumulated wealth. By the 1930s and 1940s, the top marginal income tax rate was as high as 91% on the highest incomes. Now, the Vanderbilts weren't paying 91% on all their income. Tax rates are marginal, applying only to income above certain thresholds. But they were paying substantial taxes. And more significantly, estate taxes, the taxes on wealth transferred at death, reached rates as high as 77% on the largest estates at their peak. Let's think about what this means. If a Vanderbilt died in the 1940s with an estate of $10 million, after estate taxes, the heirs might receive as little as $2 or $3 million. The rest went to the federal government. This happened at each generational transfer. Each time someone died and passed wealth to the next generation, a substantial portion was claimed by taxes. Over multiple generations. This erosion was enormous. The fourth mechanism was bad investments and business losses. Not all Vanderbilts were smart investors. Some made poor business decisions, invested in ventures that failed, trusted advisors who were incompetent or dishonest. The railroad stocks that had been the foundation of family wealth became progressively less valuable as the railroad industry declined. Some family members sold their railroad holdings and invested in other things, sometimes wisely, sometimes not. Each bad investment, each business failure, each scam or swindle eroded the capital. The fifth mechanism was inflation. This is subtle but powerful over long periods. The Commodore's $100 million in 1877 had enormous purchasing power. But as decades passed and inflation eroded the value of currency, sitting on cash or fixed income investments meant steadily declining real wealth. $1 million in 1877 might be worth something like $30 million in modern purchasing power, but if you just held it as cash through decades of inflation, by 1973 it would be worth maybe $30,000 in 1877 purchasing power. The fortune needed to be actively managed, reinvested in assets that appreciated faster than inflation to maintain its real value. The Vanderbilts didn't always do this effectively. The sixth mechanism was divorce. This became increasingly common in the 20th century as divorce laws relaxed and social stigma decreased. Alva Vanderbilt's divorce from William Kay in 1895 was scandalous partly because divorce was still relatively rare among the wealthy elite, but by the mid-20th century divorces were much more common. And each divorce meant settlements, division of assets, legal fees, all of which scattered wealth. A Vanderbilt who divorced might see half their inheritance go to an ex-spouse, who then remarried and passed that wealth to a new family, with no Vanderbilt connection. The seventh mechanism was philanthropy. Some Vanderbilts gave away substantial portions of their wealth to charitable causes. Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee, was founded with a $1 million gift from the Commodore in 1873, one of his few major philanthropic gestures. Later generations continued supporting the university and other causes. This was admirable, socially beneficial, but it also meant wealth leaving family control. Each charitable donation, each endowment, each gift to institutions meant less wealth available for family members. The eighth and perhaps most crucial mechanism was the lack of structured wealth preservation. Compare the Vanderbilts to families whose wealth survived and even grew across generations. The Rockefellers established family offices, professional organizations dedicated to managing family wealth, with investment professionals, tax experts, lawyers all working to preserve and grow the capital. They created trusts with careful governance structures. They educated each generation about wealth management and responsibility. They treated the fortune as a collective family asset to be stewarded, not as individual inheritances to be spent. The Rothschilds in Europe did something similar, maintaining family banks, keeping wealth concentrated through strategic marriages, training each generation in the family business. The DuPonts had similar structures. These families recognized that preserving great wealth across generations required active professional management and family discipline. The Vanderbilts had none of this. After William Henry's death, there was no unified family strategy. Each branch of the family managed their portion independently. Some hired good advisors, others didn't. Some were financially prudent, others spent recklessly. There was no family office coordinating investments, no patriarch enforcing discipline, no structure ensuring that the fortune would be preserved. Each heir was free to do as they wished with their inheritance, and many chose to spend it. The contrast is stark and instructive. The Rockefeller fortune, built in the same era as the Vanderbilt fortune, has not only survived but grown. There are still Rockefellers with substantial wealth today, more than a century after John D. Rockefeller Sr. built his empire. The difference wasn't in the size of the original fortune or in the business acumen of the founders. The difference was in how the subsequent generations approached wealth preservation. Let's talk about some specific Vanderbilts from the 20th century, because individual stories illuminate the broader pattern. Gloria Vanderbilt, born in 1924, was a great-great-granddaughter of the Commodore. Her father, Reginald Vanderbilt, was a grandson of William Henry. Reginald inherited a significant fortune but spent it spectacularly on gambling, drinking, and high living. When he died in 1925, much of his inheritance was gone. Gloria's portion, held in trust, was substantial but not enormous by Vanderbilt standards, perhaps a few $1,000,000. Gloria became famous as a young woman for a custody battle between her mother and her aunt, a battle that was sensationalized in the press. Later, she became a successful artist, designer, and businesswoman, particularly known for her designer jeans in the 1970s and 1980s. She was genuinely accomplished, building a successful career. But her wealth came primarily from her own work, not from her Vanderbilt inheritance. The Vanderbilt name helped. It opened doors, attracted attention, but the actual money was mostly gone. Gloria's son is Anderson Cooper, the CNN journalist and television personality. Anderson has spoken publicly about his mother and the Vanderbilt legacy. He has said explicitly that there was no trust fund waiting for him, no Vanderbilt fortune to inherit. His mother spent what wealth she had during her lifetime. He built his own successful career through his own work and talent. The Vanderbilt name is famous, recognized worldwide. But in Anderson Cooper's generation, it represents only history and heritage, not wealth. This is emblematic. There are dozens, perhaps hundreds, of Vanderbilt descendants alive today. Most have ordinary middle-class or upper-middle-class lives. Some are successful professionals, doctors or lawyers or business people who have done well through their own efforts. Others struggle economically like millions of other Americans. The name persists, the bloodline continues, but the fortune is gone. What survives today of the Vanderbilt legacy? The university in Nashville, still operating, still bearing the name, still benefiting from that initial endowment grown over a century and a half. The Breakers and Marble House and other Newport mansions. Maintained as museums by the Preservation Society, visited by hundreds of thousands of tourists each year who pay admission to see how the Gilded Age wealthy lived. Biltmore Estate, still operated by descendants of George Vanderbilt, though now primarily as a tourist attraction and winery. Grand Central Terminal in New York, though even the name was eventually removed. The statue of Cornelius that stood in front was moved. The Vanderbilt connection fading from the building his railroad empire had created. These are all markers, monuments, reminders of what once was, but they're not wealth. They're history. The actual fortune, the $200 billion in equivalent modern purchasing power, is gone, dispersed among descendants who used it to live comfortably, claimed by taxes, consumed by houses and parties and lifestyle, eroded by inflation, lost to bad investments, scattered through divorces, given away to charities, divided and subdivided until the shares were no longer meaningful, transformed from a unified empire into scattered inheritances, then into memories, then into museum exhibits and history books. The mathematics are actually quite simple when you lay them out. Start with 200 million in 1885, subtract the 150 million spent on houses and lifestyle by 1915, you're down to 50 million. Divide that among 8 children, then among their children, accounting for estate taxes at each transfer, inflation eating away at purchasing power, ongoing lifestyle consumption by each generation, some bad investments here and there. By 1973, dispersed among 120 descendants, the fortune that remained was minimal. Comfortable small inheritances for some, nothing for others, but nowhere near the concentrated wealth that would make anyone a millionaire by the standards of the 1970s. The story of where the Vanderbilt fortune went is ultimately a story about the nature of wealth itself. Wealth is not permanent unless it's actively preserved. It requires discipline, structure, professional management, family cooperation, and a willingness to prioritize preservation over consumption. The Vanderbilts, particularly from the third generation onward, lacked these qualities. They consumed rather than preserved. They divided rather than concentrated. They displayed rather than invested, and the result, inevitable in hindsight though invisible at the time, was the complete dispersal of one of history's great fortunes in less than a century. There's something almost poetic about it. The ferryboat boy who built an empire through ruthless competition and pathological frugality, whose fortune lasted barely 3 generations before evaporating. The mansions built to last centuries, demolished within decades. The family that seemed to represent permanent American aristocracy, whose descendants within 100 years were ordinary citizens. It's a story about impermanence, about how even the mightiest human achievements are temporary, about how wealth without wisdom and structure cannot endure. Let that settle for a moment. The answer to our question laid bare. $200 billion gone. Understood now, traced through its mechanisms, visible in its trajectory. Not a mystery, but a pattern. Not an anomaly, but a lesson. Rest with that understanding as we move toward reflecting on what it all means. So what does the Vanderbilt story teach us? What wisdom can we draw from this rise and fall, this spectacular accumulation and equally spectacular dispersal? The first and perhaps most universal lesson is captured in an old proverb that exists in various forms across many cultures, shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations. The Chinese say it as wealth does not pass 3 generations. The Italians phrase it as from the stable to the stars and back to the stable in 3 generations. The Scottish say, the father buys, the son builds, the grandchild sells, and his son begs. The exact words vary, but the pattern is remarkably consistent across time and culture. The first generation builds the wealth through hard work, sacrifice, and often ruthless determination. They know poverty, or at least modest circumstances. They understand the value of money because they've lived without it. They're willing to do whatever it takes to accumulate capital, to defer gratification, to prioritize building over spending. The Commodore embodied this perfectly. Working from childhood, saving obsessively, living frugally even as his fortune grew, focused entirely on accumulation and competition. The second generation grew up watching the first generation work. They have some memory of leaner times, or at least they've heard the stories. They respect the wealth because they understand, intellectually at least, how hard it was to build. They often manage the wealth competently, sometimes even growing it. They're the bridge, maintaining what was built, perhaps improving it, but beginning to enjoy it in ways the first generation never would. William Henry fit this pattern. Dutiful, hard-working, doubling the fortune but also beginning to live in greater comfort than his father ever had. The third generation grows up wealthy. They have no memory of poverty or struggle. The wealth is simply there, a fact of their existence, like air or water. They don't understand in their bones what it took to build it because they never experienced that struggle. Their parents may tell them stories about Grandpa's hard work, but stories are not the same as lived experience, so the third generation tends to spend. They consume, they display, they use the wealth to establish social position, to build monuments to their own taste and ambition, to live the life that wealth makes possible, and in doing so, they begin the dissipation. The Vanderbilt grandchildren of William Henry built their mansions through their parties, married into European nobility, and spent millions on lifestyle without maintaining the structures necessary to preserve the capital. By the fourth generation, if the pattern continues unchecked, the wealth is mostly or entirely gone. The great-grandchildren inherit fragments of what was once a unified fortune. They may have the famous name, the family history, the stories of past glory. But the actual money has dispersed, divided, been spent and taxed and inflated away until it's gone. The Vanderbilts of the fourth and fifth generations, Gloria Vanderbilt's generation, and Anderson Cooper's generation, embody this stage. The name persists, the bloodline continues, but the fortune is history. This pattern isn't inevitable. But it's common enough to be remarkable. Why? What is it about great wealth that makes it so difficult to preserve across generations? The Vanderbilt story suggests several answers. First, wealth requires active management to survive. It's not enough to simply have money and leave it sitting. Inflation erodes purchasing power. Taxes claim a portion each year. Economic conditions change, making yesterday's good investments tomorrow's losing positions. To preserve wealth, someone needs to be actively managing it, making investment decisions, minimizing tax obligations, adjusting to changing conditions, thinking strategically about the long term. The Commodore did this. William Henry did this. But after William Henry's death, there was no unified management. Each branch of the family managed their own portion, with varying degrees of skill and attention. The lack of professional coordinated management was fatal. Second, division alone can destroy any fortune, no matter how large. This is simple mathematics, but it's worth dwelling on. Each time wealth is divided among multiple heirs, the concentration diminishes. If you have 100 million and divide it among 8 children, each gets 12.5 million. If each of those 8 has 4 children, the 32 grandchildren each get about 3 million if the capital stays intact. If each of those 32 has 3 children, the 96 great-grandchildren each get about 1 million. And this assumes the capital remains intact across 3 generations, which it rarely does. The families whose fortunes have survived, the Rockefellers, the Rothschilds, the Mars family with their candy empire, found ways to limit this division, sometimes through trusts that keep capital unified while distributing only income, sometimes through business structures where the family collectively owns an operating company and shares profits without fragmenting ownership, sometimes through cultural norms like primogeniture, where one child inherits most of the wealth to keep it concentrated. The Vanderbilts did none of these things. William Henry divided the fortune, and each subsequent generation divided it further, until the fragments were too small to matter. Third, there's a crucial difference between wealth and income, between assets and liabilities. The Commodore understood this intuitively even without formal financial education. His ferries and steamships and railroads were assets. They generated income. Money came in from their operation. Even when he wasn't actively working, the businesses were making money that could be reinvested or saved. This is productive capital. But the mansions that the third generation built were liabilities disguised as assets. Yes, they were valuable in the sense that they cost millions to build, but they generated no income. They only consumed maintenance, staff, taxes, utilities, repairs. A house you live in, no matter how grand, is fundamentally a liability in financial terms. It costs money. It doesn't make money. The Vanderbilts spent enormous sums building liabilities that then required ongoing expenditure to maintain. If instead of building the breakers for $7 million, that capital had been invested in productive assets, businesses, real estate that generated rental income, bonds that paid interest, it would have generated perhaps $300,000 to $500,000 a year in income at the interest rates of that era. That income could have supported a very comfortable lifestyle while leaving the principal intact to pass to the next generation. But once the money was locked into a mansion, it was no longer working. It was just sitting there, looking beautiful and expensive while consuming wealth. Fourth, family governance matters enormously. The families who preserve wealth across generations typically develop formal or informal structures for family decision-making, wealth management, and education of rising generations. They might have family councils, regular meetings where major decisions are discussed and voted on. They have family offices with professional staff managing investments. They have trusts with careful governance provisions that limit how much any individual can withdraw. They educate children and grandchildren about money, about responsibility, about the family's values and expectations. The Vanderbilts had none of this. There was no family office coordinating investments, no family council making strategic decisions, no educational program teaching younger generations about wealth stewardship. Each branch of the family did their own thing. Some managed well. Others didn't, and critically there was no patriarch enforcing discipline after William Henry died. Cornelius had ruled the fortune with absolute authority. William Henry had managed it during his lifetime, but after William Henry there was no central authority, no one whose word was law, no mechanism for unified family action. Fifth, values and character matter as much as financial structures. The Commodore's fortune was built on his character, his competitiveness, his toughness, his willingness to work relentlessly, his frugality. These character traits enabled the accumulation. But those same traits weren't transmitted to his descendants. How could they be? The grandchildren grew up in palaces. They were raised by servants. They never experienced the hunger that drove the Commodore. You can't teach someone to be hungry when they've never missed a meal. You can't instill ruthless frugality in someone who's never wanted for anything. Some families solve this by deliberately exposing children to work and responsibility despite wealth. Warren Buffett's children, for instance, were raised middle class despite their father being one of the world's richest men. They had chores, part-time jobs, learned the value of money through experience. The Rockefellers had similar approaches in later generations, consciously trying to instill values of work and responsibility. The Vanderbilts didn't do this systematically. The children were raised as wealthy children, with all the privilege and none of the character-building struggle that had created the wealth in the first place. The American context matters too. The United States, unlike many European countries, has never had strong cultural or legal traditions supporting inherited aristocracy. American culture celebrates the self-made person, is skeptical of inherited privilege, and creates relatively few barriers to dissipating fortunes through division and taxation. Estate taxes, progressive income taxes, laws against entail and primogeniture. These are all expressions of American democratic values that make it harder to preserve dynastic wealth. This is arguably good for society as a whole, preventing the calcification of a permanent aristocracy. But it makes preserving family fortunes across generations more difficult. Let's imagine for a moment what the Commodore himself might think if he could see what happened to his fortune. Would he be appalled? Disappointed? Understanding? It's impossible to know, of course, but we can speculate based on what we know of his character. He might be furious at the waste, the spending, the frivolity. He built that fortune through decades of ruthless work, through sacrificing comfort and leisure, through winning battles against competitors who tried to destroy him. To see it spent on parties and mansions, dissipated within 3 generations, might enrage him. He gave nearly everything to William Henry specifically to prevent this kind of dispersal, and William Henry then divided it, enabling the very outcome Cornelius had tried to prevent. But he might also understand, in a way. Cornelius was a realist about human nature. He knew most people weren't as tough or as focused as he was. That's why he disinherited most of his children. He recognized they didn't have what it took to preserve what he'd built. He might look at his great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren and simply shrug. Of course they spent it. Of course they couldn't maintain it. They were never tested. They never had to fight. They were soft, and soft people don't preserve empires. He might take some satisfaction in what survived. Vanderbilt University still exists, still educates students, still bears his name. Grand Central Terminal, though the family connection is mostly forgotten, still serves New York City, still stands as a monument to the railroad empire he built. The name itself survives, recognized worldwide, associated with wealth and American history. In a sense, his immortality is secure, which might have mattered to him even if the fortune itself didn't survive intact. And perhaps most fundamentally, he might recognize that everything is temporary. He spent his whole life building, competing, accumulating. But he also watched competitors rise and fall, watched fortunes made and lost, saw businesses that seemed permanent disappear. He was too practical not to understand that nothing lasts forever, that all human achievements are eventually swept away by time and change. The fortune lasted 3 generations, which is perhaps as much as could reasonably be expected. That it didn't last longer is disappointing, but not, perhaps, surprising. What did survive? Beyond the money, what legacy persists? The buildings that remain, the breakers, Biltmore, a few others, serve as museums and tourist attractions, visited by millions of people over the decades since they ceased being private residences. They give us a window into Gilded Age life, into how the wealthy lived, into the aesthetics and values of that era. They're beautiful, genuinely beautiful, and their preservation has cultural value, even if it's not the purpose their builders intended. The university that bears the family name continues to educate tens of thousands of students, contributing to society in ways that dwarf the economic impact of the fortune itself. If the Commodore's only legacy was Vanderbilt University, that alone would be significant and lasting. The story itself survives, and stories matter. The Vanderbilt rise and fall has been told and retold, studied by economists and historians, used as a business school case study, referenced in discussions about wealth and family and American capitalism. The lessons drawn from the Vanderbilt experience have influenced how other families think about wealth preservation, how estate planners structure trusts, how families approach governance. In this sense, even the failure, the loss of the fortune, has created value by teaching others what not to do. And perhaps most subtly, but most importantly, the Vanderbilt genes and the family influence continue through the descendants, who carry on, who live their lives, who contribute to society in various ways even without vast wealth. Anderson Cooper's journalism, the doctors and lawyers and teachers and business people who happen to be Vanderbilt descendants, they're not famous for being Vanderbilts anymore. They're known for what they themselves do and achieve, and perhaps that's actually a healthier legacy than dynastic wealth would have been. Because here's a question worth contemplating. Would it have been better if the Vanderbilt fortune had survived intact? If there were still Vanderbilts today commanding billions of dollars simply because their great-great-great-grandfather was tough and smart in the 1800s, would that serve any useful purpose, for the family or for society? The dissipation of the fortune meant that capital went back into the economy, was redeployed, found new uses. The art collections that were sold in rich museums and other collectors, the mansions that were demolished made way for buildings that served modern needs. The money that was spent created employment for thousands of people, the servants who staffed the houses, the craftspeople who built them, the purveyors of luxury goods. Even the waste and excess served a kind of economic function, circulating wealth rather than hoarding it. And the descendants, freed from the burden and expectation of great wealth, were free to make their own choices, pursue their own interests, build their own achievements. Is Anderson Cooper diminished by not inheriting a Vanderbilt fortune? Or is he actually better off, having built his own successful career through his own talent and work, earning respect for his own accomplishments rather than merely being another rich heir? There's a Buddhist concept that everything is impermanent, that attachment to permanence causes suffering. The Vanderbilts attached tremendous importance to their wealth, their mansions, their social position, and watching it all slip away caused real suffering. The humiliation of having to sell beloved houses, the shame of seeing the family name associated with decline rather than triumph, the disappointment of inheriting far less than you'd expected. But perhaps the attachment itself was the problem. If they'd held it all more lightly, recognized from the start that wealth is temporary, that 3 generations of security and comfort and opportunity was actually quite a lot, the loss might have been less painful. The Commodore built his fortune from nothing in an era when that was possible in ways it might not be today. His descendants enjoyed 3 generations of extraordinary privilege, of lives lived at a level of comfort and luxury that would have seemed impossible to their ferryboat ancestor. Hundreds of people were employed because of Vanderbilt wealth. Beautiful buildings were created, art was patronized, a university was founded, and then the fortune dispersed, the wealth recycled back into the economy, and life went on. Is that a tragedy or just a natural cycle? Perhaps both. Perhaps neither. Perhaps it's simply what happens. The way fortunes and families and empires rise and fall, the way all human achievements eventually fade. The Vanderbilt story is unique in its details, but universal in its pattern. It's the story of ambition and achievement and excess and decline. It's the story of what humans do when they accumulate great power and wealth, and what happens when that wealth passes to those who didn't build it. It's the story of America itself in some ways. The rags to riches dreams, the spectacular excess, the eventual humbling, the cycle continuing. And that's why this story matters, why we're spending this time thinking about it. Not because the Vanderbilts were particularly important or because their fate was tragic, but because their story teaches us about patterns that are larger than any one family, about wealth and its preservation, about character and values, about what lasts and what doesn't, about the relationship between one generation and the next, about what we build and what we leave behind. Every person who accumulates anything, whether it's a few $1,000s or a few billion, faces smaller versions of the same questions the Vanderbilts faced. How do you preserve what you've built? How do you pass it on? How do you instill in the next generation the values that created the wealth without subjecting them to the hardships that forged those values? How do you balance enjoying the fruits of your labor with preserving capital for the future? These aren't just questions for the super wealthy. They're universal human questions, and the Vanderbilt story offers answers, both in what worked and what didn't. So as we move toward rest, toward the end of this long journey from the ferry boat to the fallen mansions, hold these lessons gently. The fortune rose and fell. The mansions were built and demolished or converted. The family scattered and continued. The pattern repeated as it always does. But something survived. Stories, lessons, buildings, a university, descendants who carry on. Not the immortality the Commodore might have wanted, but a kind of immortality nonetheless. The impermanent made permanent through memory and meaning, the temporary made lasting through the lessons it teaches. Rest with that. We're almost home. And so we return to where we began, to the water, to New York Harbor, where a young boy once worked a ferry and dreamed of something more. The water still flows, the same tides rising and falling, indifferent to the fortunes built and lost along its shores. The Vanderbilt name echoes in history now, in museum halls and university buildings, in stories told about wealth and its impermanence. $200 billion vanished like morning mist over the harbor. But something remains, the lessons, the understanding that everything we build is temporary, that all our achievements eventually fade, and that this impermanence makes them beautiful rather than meaningless. You're part of this story too, in your own way. Building something, preserving something, passing something forward to those who come after. Your scale may be different, but the questions are the same. What matters? What lasts? What do we leave behind? Let those questions go now. Let the whole story drift away like a boat disappearing into harbour fog. The Commodore rests. The mansions stand empty or transformed. The descendants carry on. And you, wherever you are, can rest too. The stars still shine above the breakers. The dawn still comes to Biltmore, and you are exactly where you need to be. Sleep well, let it all go. Good night.